The wind was a blade, sharp and merciless, slicing across the plains. It found every tear in Alara's worn coat, every gap in the wagon's canvas, a constant, whining reminder of their doom. Snow, no longer falling in gentle flakes but driven in horizontal sheets of ice, had erased the world, leaving only a churning vortex of white and gray. The horizon was gone. The track was gone. Hope had been gone for 2 days. Inside the wagon, nestled in a cocoon of every blanket and spare piece of cloth Alara owned, lay Lily. Her daughter, all of 3 years, was a fragile ember of warmth in the encroaching cold. Her breaths were shallow, little puffs of white in the frigid air. Alara's own breath hitched with every one, a desperate prayer that it would be followed by another. The fever that had taken her husband, Thomas, a week prior now clung to Lily, a malevolent ghost in their small, desolate world. The medicine was gone, used to the last drop in a futile attempt to save him. The food was a handful of hardened biscuits that tasted of dust and despair. Alara's hands were numb, clumsy things she no longer recognized as her own. She had tried to fix the shattered axle for hours, her fingers splitting in the cold, until the last of the daylight had been devoured by the storm. Now she simply sat beside the broken wheel, the wind tearing at her hair, which had come loose from its pins and whipped around her face like nettles. She was a statue of grief frozen to the spot. Thomas had promised her a new life in the West, a valley of green pastures and a home built with his own hands. He had not promised this. He had not promised a lonely death in an ocean of white, a grave marker made of a broken wagon wheel. Her mind, dulled by cold and hunger, began to drift. She saw Thomas's face, his smile warm and confident as he pointed at the map. Just over this last ridge, Alara. Then we'll be there. He was a good man, a kind man, but the prairie did not care for goodness. It was a vast, indifferent entity that swallowed dreams and broke bodies with equal disregard. The cold was seeping into her bones now, a deep, final chill that promised a sleep from which she would not wake. She thought of Lily alone. The thought was a shard of glass in her heart, sharp enough to cut through the lethargy. She had to move. She had to do something. But what? Where could she go? The world was a blank page of snow, and she was a single, fading word. It was then she saw it, a shape, darker than the storm, moving through the white chaos. At first, she thought it a trick of the light, a phantom conjured by a freezing mind. But it grew steadily larger, more solid. A horse and rider, immense and unyielding against the gale. They moved with a purpose that seemed impossible in this maelstrom, as if the storm itself parted for them. Fear, cold and sharp, pierced through her numbness. Stories from the last trading post echoed in her memory. Tales of a man who lived in the high country, a giant who shunned all contact, a figure of dark legend. They called him Silas. A deserter, some said. A murderer, whispered others. A man who had turned his back on the world and was best left alone. The men at the post had spoken of him with a mixture of fear and grudging respect, a boogeyman for the wilderness. The rider was closer now, close enough for her to see the sheer scale of him. He dwarfed the great warhorse he rode, his shoulders a bulwark against the wind, a heavy fur cloak making him seem even larger. He was the mountain-made man. He stopped some 20 feet from the wagon, the horse snorting, its breath pluming in the air. He sat there, utterly still, a sentinel surveying her ruin. He was her worst fear made flesh, the final, brutal punctuation to her tragedy. But then Lily coughed, a small, weak sound from inside the wagon, and something inside Alara broke. Fear was a luxury. Pride was a memory. All that was left was the primal, ferocious instinct of a mother. She would not let her child die here. She would not let their story end as a footnote in a spring thaw. Staggering to her feet, her legs screaming with protest, she stumbled toward the colossal figure. The wind pushed her back, a physical blow, and she fell to her knees in the deepening snow. She could feel his gaze on her, heavy and unreadable from beneath the brim of his hat. He made no move to help, no sign of pity. He was simply watching her fail. She pushed herself up again, her hands raw, her body shaking uncontrollably. One step, another. The snow was up to her shins, each movement a monumental effort. She finally reached his horse, her hand landing on the creature's warm, trembling flank. She looked up, her vision blurred by tears and the relentless snow, at the man who loomed over her like a thunderhead. His face was hard, carved from granite and shadow, framed by a thick, dark beard dusted with ice. His eyes were the color of a winter sky just before nightfall. They held no warmth, no malice, only a profound and unnerving stillness. Her voice was a ragged whisper, nearly stolen by the wind. "Please," she croaked, the sound pathetic and small. It was not enough. He had to understand. He had to see past the broken woman and see the dying child. She drew a shuddering breath, gathering the last of her strength, the final vestiges of her soul, and pushed the words out. "Please, I'm begging you." She collapsed then, the final plea taking everything she had left. Her face fell against the cold, wet leather of his boot, the world dissolving into a dark, swirling void. She was distantly aware of movement, of the creak of leather and a sudden shadow falling over her. A hand, shockingly large and calloused, took hold of her arm. It was not rough. It was firm, impossibly strong, and it lifted her as if she weighed nothing at all. He pulled her up, forcing her to stand, his grip the only thing keeping her from falling. He held her there for a long moment, the wind howling around them, and in the swirling chaos, their eyes met. She saw his gaze shift from her face to the pathetic canvas of the wagon behind her, where a small, pained whimper could just be heard over the storm. His expression did not change, the hard lines of his face did not soften, but something in the depths of those gray eyes flickered. It was not pity, it was not compassion, it was a profound, echoing shock. The famous giant, the monster of the mountains, pulled her up from the snow and was left utterly, completely stunned. He was stunned by the raw, unvarnished desperation in her eyes, by the sound of the child, by the sudden, unwelcome intrusion of a world of pain and need into his self-imposed exile. He was looking at a ghost, and he saw not a stranger, but a reflection of a life he had fought for years to bury. The journey to his cabin was a blur of motion and misery. Silas had, without a word, lifted Lily from the wagon, his massive hands impossibly gentle as he wrapped her shivering form in his own fur cloak. He placed the child in Alara's arms and then hoisted them both onto the saddle in front of him, his body a solid wall against the punishing wind. He did not speak, did not offer a single word of comfort or explanation. He simply turned the great horse and urged it forward, away from the wreckage of Alara's life, into the heart of the blizzard. Alara clung to her daughter, her face pressed into the warm, animal-scented fur of the cloak. She could feel the steady, powerful rhythm of the horse beneath them and the unyielding presence of the man behind her. His arm was a steel band around her waist, holding her secure. She should have been terrified, captive to a man of violent repute, but all she could feel was a strange, hollowed-out sense of surrender. She had begged, and the universe, in its cruel and mysterious way, had answered with a monster. She could only pray he was not the kind that devoured what he saved. The landscape they moved through was treacherous and invisible, a shifting world of white. Yet, Silas navigated it with an unnerving confidence, as if he could read the hidden contours of the land beneath the snow. He was not fighting the storm, he was a part of it, moving with its brutal logic. Hours bled into one another. The world was nothing but the shriek of the wind, the plodding of hooves, and the warmth of her child in her arms. Lily had thankfully fallen into a deep, fevered sleep, her small body limp against Alara's. Just as Alara felt she could hold on no longer, that the cold had finally won and would claim her, they descended into a small, protected canyon. The wind lessened its assault, and through the trees, she saw the faint, golden glow of a window. A cabin, tucked so cleverly against a rock face that it seemed to have grown there. It was small, solid, made of thick, dark logs chinked with mud. Smoke curled from a stone chimney, a fragile banner of life in the desolate expanse. Inside, the cabin was a single room, Spartan and severe. A stone hearth dominated one wall, a low fire casting dancing shadows. A rough-hewn table with a single stool, a cot in the corner, and shelves holding a few tins and neatly stacked hides. It was a space built for solitude, for function, not for comfort. There was no sign of another life, no woman's touch, no hint of a past. It was the den of a hibernating bear. Silas slid from the horse and lifted her and Lily down. He carried the child to the cot, laying her down with that same surprising gentleness. He then turned to Alara, his gaze sweeping over her, assessing. He pointed toward the fire. It was a command, not a suggestion. She stumbled toward the hearth, her frozen limbs clumsy, and sank onto the floor before the flames, soaking in the heat. It was a painful, prickling sensation as her body began to thaw, but it was the most wonderful pain she had ever felt. The days that followed unfolded in a shared, nearly unbroken silence. The blizzard raged outside for 3 more days, locking them inside the small cabin. Silas moved with a quiet economy, his large frame never seeming out of place in the confined space. He tended the fire, melted snow for water, and prepared a thin, savory broth from dried meat, which he gave to Alara to spoon-feed to Lily. He rarely spoke. When he did, his voice was a low rumble, like rocks grinding together. "Eat," he would say, placing a bowl of stew before her. "Sleep." He would gesture toward a pile of furs he had laid out for her near the fire. His words were commands born of necessity, stripped of all pleasantry. Alara's world shrank to the dimensions of that room, to the rise and fall of her daughter's chest. Lily's fever was a terrible, consuming fire. Alara bathed her forehead with cool water, whispered stories her own mother had told her, and sang lullabies until her throat was raw. Through it all, Silas was a constant, silent presence. He would watch her for long moments, his expression unreadable, before turning back to his own tasks. Sharpening a knife, mending a piece of leather, or simply staring into the flames, lost in thoughts she could not begin to guess. Slowly, tentatively, a strange rhythm established itself between them. It was a partnership of survival, communicated not through words, but through actions. When she ran out of clean cloths for Lily, she woke one morning to find a neatly folded stack of soft, worn linen on the table. When she saw him wince as he stretched his shoulder, she took his torn coat from its peg while he was outside and meticulously stitched the seam. Her fingers still stiff but her stitches even and strong. He noticed it when he returned, his eyes flicking to the repair. He said nothing, but the next day, a small, intricately carved wooden bird appeared on the cot next to Lily. Her fear of him began to recede, replaced by a deep and unsettling curiosity. This was not the monster from the stories. The monster was the storm, the fever, the indifference of the world. This man, for all his harshness and silence, was a guardian. She saw the way his hands, capable of felling a tree or dressing a deer, could be so careful when adding a log to the fire, ensuring no sparks flew toward her and the child. She saw the exhaustion in the lines around his eyes after he returned from a long day checking his trap lines in the deep snow. He was not a brute. He was a man who had walled himself away from the world, and she and her daughter had breached those walls. One evening, after the storm had finally broken, Lily's fever broke with it. Alara had woken from a light doze to find her daughter's forehead cool, her breathing even and deep. Tears of relief streamed down Alara's face, silent and cleansing. Silas was sitting at the table, watching her, the firelight catching the complex topography of his face. For the first time, she saw not just a hard man, but a tired one, a man carrying a weight far heavier than his own massive frame. She looked at him across the flickering space that separated them, her heart full of a gratitude so immense it was painful. "Thank you," she whispered, the first words she had volunteered in days. His gaze held hers. He gave a slow, almost imperceptible nod. For him, it was a speech. For her, it was everything. In the quiet of that cabin, surrounded by a world of white, a fragile, unspoken trust had been forged. It was not built on promises or confessions, but on shared warmth, mended cloth, and a small, carved bird. It was a trust born not of affection, but of a mutual recognition of the will to endure. Weeks turned into a month. The snow began its slow retreat, revealing the hard, brown earth in patches. Lily, though still pale and thin, regained her strength. Her laughter, when it first echoed in the quiet cabin, was a sound so startling and sweet that both Alara and Silas stopped what they were doing. Alara saw a flicker of something in the corner of his mouth, the barest hint of a smile, gone as quickly as it appeared. Alara found her own purpose in their shared solitude. She cooked and cleaned, turning the Spartan cabin into something resembling a home. She learned to read the sky for weather, to identify the tracks of animals in the mud. She felt a strength returning to her limbs, a resilience she never knew she possessed blooming in her spirit. The woman who had collapsed in the snow was a distant memory, a ghost she no longer recognized. She had been stripped of everything: her husband, her home, her future, and in that emptiness, she was discovering who she was meant to be. Silas began to leave for longer periods, hunting in the high country. He would always return with fresh meat, leaving it on the porch without a word. He was providing for them, yet maintaining his distance, as if this fragile domesticity was a flame he was afraid to get too close to. Alara understood. His solitude was his armor, and she was a chink in it. One afternoon, while Silas was away, Alara took Lily outside to feel the first truly warm kiss of the spring sun. The air was clean and sharp, smelling of pine and damp earth. It was a day of such profound peace that the arrival of the riders felt like a violation, a tear in the fabric of their quiet world. There were 3 of them, their horses churning the soft ground. The man in the lead was dressed in a fine city coat that looked absurdly out of place. He was thin-lipped and pale, his eyes small and greedy. Alara recognized him instantly. Mr. Thorne, the land agent from the last town they'd passed through, the one who held the mortgage on nearly every claim in the territory, including theirs. "Well, well, the grieving widow?" Thorne said, his voice slick with false sympathy as he dismounted. His 2 companions, brutish men with cruel faces, remained on their horses, flanking him like gargoyles. "We heard you'd run into some trouble. Thought we'd come and see if we could offer our assistance." Alara's heart hammered against her ribs, but she stood her ground, pulling Lily behind her skirts. She had seen Thorne's brand of assistance before. He preyed on the unfortunate, buying up claims for pennies on the dollar from families broken by hardship. "We are fine, Mr. Thorne. Thank you for your concern." His eyes swept over the cabin, a dismissive sneer on his face. "Living in a squatter's hovel with that mountain savage? I wouldn't call that fine, Mrs. Gable. I'd call it desperate." He took a step closer, pulling a sheaf of papers from his coat. "Your husband, may he rest in peace, was behind on his payments. The land is forfeit. However, I am a charitable man. Sign the deed over to me, and I'll give you enough to get you and the child to a proper city. I'll even forget you've been cohabitating with a wanted man." The threat was clear, wrapped in a thin veil of civility. The air grew cold, the spring warmth vanishing. This was a different kind of storm, a different kind of monster. This one wore a fine coat and spoke in reasonable tones. The Alara of 2 months ago would have wept. She would have pleaded. But she was not that woman anymore. The silence of the mountains had seeped into her bones, and Silas's quiet strength had become a lesson she had unknowingly absorbed. "The claim is not for sale," she said, her voice low but steady. It did not tremble. "And I am not in the habit of discussing my affairs with vultures." Thorne's face flushed with anger. The mask of civility dropped. "You foolish woman. Do you think you have a choice?" He gestured to one of his men. "Get the child. A mother is always more reasonable when her child's welfare is at stake." The man started to dismount, a leering grin on his face. A primal fear, cold and absolute, seized Alara, but it was immediately followed by a wave of pure, unadulterated rage. She shoved Lily behind her, grabbing a heavy piece of firewood from the pile beside the door. She held it like a club, her knuckles white. "You will not touch her." "Brave words," Thorn scoffed. "But you are one woman, alone and—" His words were cut short by a sound that made all three men freeze. It was the click of a hammer being pulled back on a rifle, a sound that was unnaturally loud in the sudden silence of the clearing. Silas stood at the edge of the woods, as still and imposing as the ancient pines behind him. He must have been watching for some time. He held a large-caliber hunting rifle, and it was aimed squarely at Thorn's chest. His face was a mask of cold fury, his gray eyes chips of ice. He had not made a sound on his approach. He had simply materialized, a spirit of vengeance summoned from the forest itself. "She is not alone," Silas said. His voice was not a rumble now. It was flat, hard, and deadly. Thorn's face went pale. He had heard the stories, but the reality of the man was far more intimidating. "Silas, this is a legal matter. It has nothing to do with you." "You are on my land," Silas stated, taking a slow step forward. The rifle did not waver. "You are threatening my guests. That makes it my business." "Guests?" Thorn laughed, a nervous, high-pitched sound. "You're harboring a fugitive's widow. The law will—" "The law is a long way from here," Silas interrupted, his voice dropping even lower. "But I am not." He took another step. The two men on horseback shifted uneasily, their hands hovering near their pistols. Silas's gaze flicked to them, a look of such profound menace that both men seemed to shrink in their saddles. "You have two choices," Silas said, his eyes locking back onto Thorn. "You can get on your horse and ride away from this mountain and never return. Or you can stay here and be buried on it." There was no bluff in his tone. It was a simple statement of fact, as elemental as the rock and the trees. Thorn stared at the unwavering rifle, at the giant of a man who looked ready to tear them apart with his bare hands, and his greed finally gave way to his instinct for self-preservation. "This isn't over," he hissed, backing away toward his horse. "Yes," Silas said softly. "It is." Thorn scrambled into his saddle, and he and his men spurred their horses, turning and fleeing the clearing as if the devil himself were at their heels. They disappeared into the trees, the sound of their frantic retreat fading until only the whisper of the wind remained. Alara's arm, holding the heavy piece of wood, finally fell to her side. The strength drained from her, leaving her trembling, but she did not fall. She stood tall, watching as Silas lowered his rifle and walked toward her. He stopped a few feet away, his eyes searching her face, then looking down at Lily, who was peering out from behind Alara's skirt. The silence that fell between them was different now. It was not the silence of strangers sharing a space, but the quiet aftermath of a battle fought and won together. The unspoken trust, forged in the heart of winter, had been tempered in the fire of this confrontation. It was now something solid, something real, something unbreakable. The fire in the hearth crackled, a warm and steady heartbeat in the quiet cabin. Outside, the last vestiges of daylight painted the sky in bruised shades of purple and orange. Lily was asleep on the cot, the small wooden bird clutched in her hand. The confrontation with Thorn felt like a lifetime ago, a bad dream that had trespassed into the waking world and been brutally expelled. Alara sat at the rough-hewn table, her hands wrapped around a warm tin cup of herbal tea that Silas had prepared. He sat opposite her on the stool, cleaning his rifle with meticulous, practiced movements. The scent of gun oil mingled with the smell of wood smoke. For a long time, neither of them spoke. The silence was no longer a void to be endured, but a space to be shared, comfortable and laden with meaning. Finally, Alara broke it, her voice soft. "He said you were a wanted man." Silas did not look up from his work, his large hands moving with fluid grace over the steel and wood. "Some men's wants are not the law's." It was a cryptic answer, but she didn't press. She knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her soul, that whatever he had done, Whatever had driven him to this self-imposed exile, he was not an evil man. She had seen evil today, in the greedy eyes of Mr. Thorne. It bore no resemblance to the quiet, protective man sitting across from her. "They will be back," she said. It was not a question. "Thorne is not a man to let things go. He'll bring the marshal, tell him you threatened him. He'll twist the story." "Let him," Silas said, finally looking up. His gray eyes met hers in the flickering firelight. "This mountain knows how to keep its secrets." In that moment, a choice presented itself to Alara, as clear and sharp as a shard of ice. She could take Lily and leave. She could try to make it to the next territory, to start over, to run from Thorne and from the complications of this man's life. Or she could stay. She could stand her ground, not behind him but beside him. She thought of the life Thomas had promised her, a life of settlement and society, of neighbors and church bells. It seemed like a dream belonging to someone else. The wilderness had stripped her down to her very essence, and she had discovered not a frightened townswoman, but a survivor. This harsh, beautiful land, this quiet, formidable man. They felt more like home than any place she had ever known. Home was not a place on a map. It was a sanctuary you built, a fortress you defended. "My husband's claim," she began, her voice gaining strength. "It has a spring-fed creek and a small, flat meadow, good for a garden. It's defensible, sheltered on 3 sides by a ravine." Silas stopped his work, his full attention on her. He was listening, truly listening. "It would be a better place to winter than this cabin," she continued, the plan forming in her mind as she spoke. "Safer for a child. We could build a proper home. There's timber enough." She was not asking for his help. She was not pleading for his protection. She was offering a partnership. She was laying out a blueprint for a future that included him, if he would have it. She was offering him a way back into the world, not the world of towns and trivialities he had fled, but a new world, one they would build together on their own terms. He watched her, his expression unreadable for a long moment. She saw a flicker of conflict in his eyes, the struggle of a man long accustomed to solitude, being offered a connection he had denied himself for years. He had saved her from the storm, and in doing so, he had inadvertently saved himself from the frozen stillness of his own life. She and Lily were the spring thaw, breaking apart the ice he had allowed to form around his heart. He looked over at the sleeping child, then back at Alara. He saw not the desperate, pleading woman from the snowstorm, but a woman of quiet strength and fierce resolve. A woman who had faced down death and greed and had not broken. A woman who looked at him not as a monster or a savior, but as a man. He did not give her a grand speech. He did not make a sweeping promise. His actions, as always, spoke for him. He rose from the stool, walked to the hearth, and picked up a charred stick from the embers. He knelt on the floorboards and, in the warm glow of the fire, began to sketch. A square for a cabin, a line for the creek, an X for a barn. He was adding to her blueprint, accepting her offer, building their future with a piece of burnt wood on a dusty floor. Alara knelt beside him, her earlier trembling replaced by a profound sense of peace. She pointed to a spot on his crude map. "The garden should go here," she said, her voice steady and clear, "to catch the morning sun." He nodded, a slow, deliberate movement, a silent agreement, a pact sealed not with a handshake or a vow, but with shared charcoal lines on a cabin floor. The next morning, Alara was awake before the dawn. She moved with a quiet purpose, packing their few belongings not to flee, but to build. She was no longer a passenger in her own life. She was a pioneer, ready to stake her claim on the future. When Silas emerged from the cabin, he found her loading their supplies onto his pack mule. She looked up as he approached, the first rays of the sun catching the new strength in her eyes. There was no fear there, no dependence, only determination. He stood for a moment, simply watching her. Then, he walked to a peg by the door and took down a length of finely braided leather, a rein he had been mending. He walked over to her and held it out. It was a simple object, a simple gesture, but it was a promise. It was an acknowledgement that their paths were now intertwined. They were two solitary souls who had found in each other a reason to endure, a reason to build. Together they would face whatever came. The changing seasons, the harshness of the land, and the men who would seek to undo them. They were no longer alone, and in that shared reality, there was a quiet, unassailable hope.